So as you may be able to tell from my voice, I'm not operating 100% capacity right now. In particular, my throat is a little bit sore and gravelly, and so I'm going to try to keep my volume lower than I normally do. So if you're having trouble hearing me, you may want to move up from the back, since I'll have to project more during this service. Make sure I do get to the people in the back. If you can't hear me real well, please move on up a little bit. So, okay. We've been looking at 2 Peter, and I want to kind of refresh us where we're at in 2 Peter, because we've spent the last couple of weeks looking at tangential passages relating to the different, Peter's version, I guess, of almost what we would call the fruit of the Spirit. And so I wanted to go back and take another look at the Peter passage just real quickly here as we go into this, so we kind of remember what we're talking about in the big picture. And so we looked at this several weeks ago, and Peter says, "For this very reason also, applying all diligence, in your faith supply moral excellence, and in your moral excellence knowledge, and in your knowledge self-control, in your self-control perseverance, in your perseverance godliness, and in your godliness brotherly kindness, and in your brotherly kindness love. For if these qualities are yours and are increasing, they render you neither useless nor unfruitful in the true knowledge of our Lord Jesus Christ." A little side note here. I've mentioned this before. I don't know how many of you actually remember it, because if you're anything like my students, you don't always pay attention to everything I say. But does anybody know what this is the American Standard Version. Anybody know what the italicized words in the American Standard Version mean?
Not in the oldest manuscripts.
Well, you're close, but not quite. Anybody else want to give it a try? So it's actually, go ahead.
Words that were added to make it sound more like modern English?
Yes, actually. They're words that were added to either clarify the meaning or to make it sound more like modern English. Now, this is one place, I find it interesting, this is why I bring it up. Many of the places where they do add those words, it really does make a lot of sense. But here, it's interesting because they added a bunch of yours in there that I don't really think are necessary. Would it be really difficult for you to realize they were talking about you when he starts off by saying, "In your faith supply moral excellence, and in moral excellence knowledge, and in knowledge self-control"? I mean, would anybody go, "Oh, I wonder whose knowledge they're talking about"? You know? So it's kind of one of those places where, and even at the end where it says, "For if these qualities are yours," if it just says, "If these are yours," there again, I don't think it would have been hard for us to figure out what we're talking about. So normally, I appreciate this from the American Standard. For some reason, in this particular case, it seemed like they just kind of got a little bit too paternalistic for us and had to make sure we weren't confused about something that shouldn't have been confusing to us anyway, but whatever. So that's my little tangent for the day. So we got all the way through perseverance last week. We're going to talk about godliness this week. And when it comes to godliness, there's kind of two different views that the world has of godliness. There's either following rules really strictly and not having any fun, or there is the New Age kind of theory that God is in us anyway, so you can't really do anything wrong as long as you give Him. As long as you are aware of and are giving honor to that idea. And I don't mean giving honor to it by how you behave, I mean giving honor to it in the sense of that you are acting as though you were God of your own life. And neither one of these is what the Scriptures is ever talking about when it talks about godliness. Now, we know that the Holy Spirit indwells us, and so we do have a part of God in us, but not in the sense of elevating us to gods. It operates in us to help us to act in ways that are pleasing to God, which is a very, very different concept. And it transforms us into the likeness of Christ, which is also a very different concept, because Christ, as in his human form here on earth, had given up a significant portion of his godhood. Not everything. We don't fully understand this concept. Perhaps we will when we're in heaven or when we're in eternity, but we don't fully understand this concept. But he gave up significant aspects of his godhood, including his omnipotence and his omnipresence in particular, in order to be able to be human. And so when we're being transformed into the likeness of Christ, it's speaking more in those terms than it is in the sense of we're becoming a God like Christ or something like that. And so when when Peter says godliness, what he's talking about is this kind of godliness, doing things that are pleasing to God and doing things that are in the likeness of Christ, our Master, who we saw as an example here during his time on earth. And of course, Peter would know more about that than almost any human being ever could have, because he spent more time with him than just about any other human being did, at least during the time of his ministry. So Paul says, speaking of godliness, do not let sin reign in your mortal body so that you obey its lusts. And right there we see the first word that's really critical, obey. Because Paul talks about this a lot. Mastery. You can be mastered by God or you can be mastered by sin. If you think you're mastering yourself, the truth is that you are a master, you are being mastered by sin. So you're obeying its lusts because it's reigning in your mortal body. And do not go on presenting the members of your body to sin as instruments of unrighteousness, but present yourselves to God as those alive from the dead, and your members as instruments of righteousness to God. For sin shall not be master over you, for you are not under law, but under grace. Which brings us to kind of an interesting point that Paul makes on a number of occasions in Romans and Galatians and elsewhere, which is, if you're under law and you're trying to follow the law, then you really are kind of under sin's mastery. Because the power of law, or the sting of the law is sin, or sorry, I'm getting that wrong. Law is unable to deal with sin. It only gives you, here's what you're supposed to do. Because we don't do what we're supposed to do, we end up sinning, and the result of law becomes sin, which is not the intent, but nevertheless the outcome because of our imperfection. And so sin is mastering us if we try to follow the law and make our lives about law. But Paul says, nevertheless, if you're under grace, you have the ability to choose through the Spirit not to sin, not to be mastered by sin. And to the extent that you do fall and trip and sin and stumble and those kinds of things as you go along, grace makes up the difference for that and allows you to keep on presenting yourself to God as an honorable instrument, an instrument of His will instead of God's will, or instead of sin's will. Okay, let's see here. I'm getting ahead, so I should stop and ask if anybody has anything they want to add to that.
I do have a question. I forget exactly where it's at in the Bible, but it's a worse sin to create a circumstance that causes somebody else to sin than it is the actual sin that's being created, correct?
I don't know that there's a worse concept to it, but Jesus does talk about the idea that it would be better for you if you cause a little one to stumble or to sin. You'll tie a millstone around your neck, which would basically be half a ton rock around your neck, and toss it into the sea, which would take you right along with it.
Well, what I was thinking of is, like, what if you were a king and you did something to bring a marriage apart, and you caused both people to, fornicate or something? Well, then you as the king would be guilty of their fornication, and that would be a worse sin than the fornication itself.
I don't know of anything in the Bible that specifically addresses that particular idea of being causing someone to sin. Well, if you can find it again, by all means, bring it out.
Okay.
I'm not familiar with that concept. I know that causing someone to sin, like I said, Jesus talks about that in the sense of that it is an awful thing to cause somebody else to sin or to create a stumbling effect on other people. And there certainly are things to talk about, like teachers having a higher responsibility because they are responsible for what people are thinking, the word says and stuff. But exactly what you've said, I don't know that I'm familiar with that concept. But anyway, godliness is primarily directed at how we operate ourselves, and whether we're operating under grace and obedience, or whether we're operating under law and disobedience, or whether we're just operating under whatever we want to do, which is sin and disobedience then. So, okay. So then in Ephesians, Paul says, but you did not learn Christ in this way. And this is after someone had been talking, in Ephesians, a situation where they've been talking about, or he's been talking about, they're doing, basically behaving in ways that are licentious, that are not godly, that are lustful. And he says, you didn't learn Christ in this way. This is not how you came to Him. If indeed you have heard Him and have been taught in Him, just as truth is in Jesus, that in reference to your former manner of life, you lay aside the old self, which is being corrupted in accordance with the lusts of deceit, and that you be renewed in the spirit of your mind, and put on the new self, which in the likeness of God has been created in righteousness and holiness of the truth. So Paul says, godliness comes not through you being such a good person or doing so many good things. It comes rather through the transformative power of the Holy Spirit in us that is remaking us into the image of Christ, into the image of God. Again, not in terms of our omnipotence and omniscience and any of that kind of stuff, but rather in terms of our ability to do what is pleasing to God. And it talks about renewing the spirit of your mind. What is the old spirit, the old sinful spirit? What does that look like? What does a person who's governed by that spirit look like?
The flesh, selfishness.
Okay, selfishness. What else? This is one of those questions that doesn't have just one right answer. So, what else? feeling like I am teaching at high school.
Lawlessness.
Lawlessness, okay.
Not-
So in some cases, we see it manifest itself in terms of somebody who just refuses to follow the rules, rebelliousness, those kind of things. But a lot of times we don't see it in those terms. In the world, we don't necessarily. There are certainly a large group of people, and it's getting larger all the time, that are rebellious and lawless, who just don't want to follow any rules. But the vast majority of the people that we encounter who nevertheless don't have Christ are not lawless and not rebellious in an outward way. We don't see them just trying to break rules, and they don't like anything, any rules or any limitations. They're fine with most of the limitations of society. But where does their behavior, where does their giving honor to rules break down when it comes to God?
It would be the world versus anything spiritual.
Okay, but I want to kind of identify what it is that we see in the behaviors of the people in the world, other than outright rebelliousness, that kind of speaks to this idea of the spirit, or the spirit of the mind that is a lawless spirit. What is it that the world is focused on besides just rebellion?
Well, they don't want to submit to the Lord, and so if the Ten Commandments says do this, they instinctively want to do the opposite.
Okay, well that's the rebellion side. That's true. But there's a lot of people who aren't Christians, whose minds have not been renewed, who don't want to go commit adultery, and don't want to go murder anybody. They're not planning to steal anything. They do a lot of things that in our country at least, if you look at them, they blend right in with all the people who are claiming to be Christians. So I got Sarah, and then I've got my roommate, whose name I said Sue. Wow, that's just right out of my head. Okay, Sarah, go ahead.
Selfishness, since they don't have a center for rules, then they do whatever makes them feel good, and that can be charitable,
Okay.
but it can also be just for themselves.
Okay. So one of the things that we see is that it's not necessarily that everything that they want to do is bad. It's one of the reasons why I say that our time is not as bad as the time of Noah. Because if the scriptures are to be believed literally, and sometimes they use, they overstate things to make a point, but still, if the scriptures are to be taken literally, it says every inclination was evil. Well, today, a lot of people's inclination, even when they're not doing, when they're not following the Spirit of God, is to do nice things to people, is to be kind to people, at least some of the time. But when you kind of distill it down, there is a fundamental selfishness that is motivating people. And they may do nice things either because it makes them feel good, or because they feel like that's what they're supposed to do, or because that's what society expects them to do. But ultimately, if you distill it down to the most basic, if they're presented with, here's what you need to do because it will be pleasing to God, and that runs contrary to what they want to do, they're not going to choose to do that most of the time anyway. Sue, what were you going to say?
I was just going to say that they're kind of lacking in the real feeling of brotherhood, that we're all in this together, and we should be helping each other and caring about each other.
Okay, so there is a disconnection from the sense of being part of a larger whole with a larger motivation than just what they want and what they perceive. I think I saw your hand.
Well, I was going to say that Paul, I think, said that they have a kind of righteousness, but they deny the Spirit, they're not sensitive to the Spirit.
Okay, so there is an attempt to conform to the rules as they are willing to and as they see them, but ultimately it's a facade. Yeah, okay. Mark?
I was just gonna say, maybe what I'm thinking about is they don't want God to be over them. In other words, their master. They don't want to go that far. They want to say, I'm in control, and so then I will do what's good for me. But they'll never put their allegiance or their life to God. In other words, He's above me. So this world is being taught, do what you want to do, make yourself happy, and everything's fine. It's just that same thing. They believe that God is in us all. So then there is no self-responsibility. I can do what I want to do, whatever makes me happy. And so you never put God where He belongs. He is over everything, and if you believe that, then you're under Him, and you've got to serve Him.
Okay. So it's kind of, in a sense, they end up treating God sort of like we treat gravity, where we know it exists, but it's only really a problem for us under a few limited circumstances. And the rest of the time, we just kind of, I mean, you don't spend a lot of your time thinking about the importance of gravity, you know, we just don't, we're just used to it. But as a practical matter, imagine what the world would be like if there was no gravity. I mean, how chaotic things would be. But we don't spend our time focused on that, and we don't view gravity as being in control of us, although there's a real sense in which, physically speaking, it is. But we don't make our decisions. You know, we don't think about the dangers of that on a regular basis unless we're in a situation where it has an immediate impact on us. And I think when it comes to God, a lot of people are like that too. They have a general, vague belief that He exists, but it doesn't really translate into any sort of behavior that's meaningful, except maybe in times of crisis when they start praying, or in times where the society, if it's, you know, the people that they're around are also people who do believe in God, either for, you know, in a real way, a real faith, or just in a general way, and it limits their behavior because they know that if they did something too inappropriate, that would cause, you know, pushback from the people that they're friends with and that they're related to. And so God becomes more of a general idea of a force out there. And there's actually a word we have for this. It's not a super old word, but it's a word that was used to describe many of our founding fathers, who were what were called deists. They believed that God was more of a generalized force than a singular individual who had rules, and so that rather than God saying, you know, I've created you and here's now what I want from you, it was more like God is a creative entity, and flowing out of Him are rules for how people should behave and things like that. And so in their view, God is the guy who builds a watch and creates very, very complex, for the time at least, very, very complex mechanisms that make it work, and then puts it in motion. And from that point on, those complex mechanisms sort of govern themselves, and they make it so that there's certain ways things should be and certain ways things shouldn't be. And then God kind of steps back and says, okay, I've put it in motion, I've set up all the rules, it can do its own thing now, you know. And that's obviously not the sort of God that we believe in, but it is a way that I think a lot of people really treat God, even if they don't think of it in those terms. Well, He started things and He made some rules and He does nice things for me when I pray, kind of like Santa Claus does. Except you don't pray to, well, I mean, some kids probably do pray to Santa Claus, I don't know, but anyway, I can imagine that happening. But it's kind of like His involvement in the world is minimal, except if you call His attention to it. And this is a concept you see a lot in popular, in science fiction, fantasy, and stuff like that. The idea that until you call on some supernatural force, it generally doesn't pay attention to you. And so on the one hand, you want to be really careful about saying the name of something that is powerful and dangerous unless you intend to call its attention to you. But on the other hand, when you need it, if you call their attention, then they'll pay attention to you. And that's just not how it works with God. God is conscious of everything, and He's paying attention to everything. And so it's one of those things where we hear it enough in our culture that it starts to be something that a lot of people internalize, even if they don't think about it in those terms. John?
The New Age recapitulates that as natural law.
Yeah. Well, and in many ways, the founding fathers did as well, although they had a very different understanding of it than the New Age does. But yes, that's true. They talk about it in terms of, and if you remember, that's what, when in the Declaration of Independence, that's what the founding fathers basically said, is they're endowed by their creator. They didn't say God, they said their creator with certain inalienable rights. Natural law that flows out of the nature of creation is basically what they're arguing for. So that's not what Christianity teaches. That's not what Judaism teaches. It's not what the Bible teaches. That it doesn't teach this idea of some generalized creation turned loose to do what it wants to do, and you can either follow the laws built into creation and be happy, or not follow them and be unhappy. It doesn't teach any of that. It teaches a very different approach to thinking about the world and thinking about how we behave. And so Paul says we are being renewed in the spirit of our mind. And what does renewed mean normally?
Reborn? Or rebuilt?
Restarted, reborn, rebuilt. All of those are, they all have that re in front of in front of it. But it's the idea of going back to a previous setting and doing it right is kind of what you're talking about here. So in a sense, there's a way in which I suppose we could say that what's happening is that we are being taken back to before the fall and being reset to the calibration that Adam and Eve had before the fall. Not that we no longer have any consciousness of sin, because that is an inevitability of our current fall, and the fact that we fell, you don't get to forget about that. But you get to go back to a place where you did have true innocence. So for most of us, that could also be viewed as sort of going back to a point when we were more childlike. And Jesus even talks about how important it is to be childlike in terms of our faith and in terms of our innocence. So we're being reset back to that kind of default setting. And then going forward, living our lives with that understanding about reality, as well as layered on top of that, the wisdom that comes with knowing that reality doesn't always go the way it's supposed to in the world. God's reality always looks the way it's supposed to, but the reality of the world does not. And so we have the wisdom that comes with experience, but the innocence that comes with being renewed in the spirit of our minds. Which, one of the things that becomes more and more striking the more I study the scriptures is the degree to which Christianity is a series of, I don't want to say contradictions, because we don't like that word. Paradoxes is a better word, because paradoxes sometimes do exist where contradictions don't. It is a series of paradoxes. We're supposed to be, this is a scripture, we're supposed to be innocent, and yet we're supposed to be wise. And generally, wisdom only comes with the loss of innocence. At least the world looks at it that way. We are supposed to be becoming like God, and yet we're supposed to recognize that we aren't God. And we're supposed to be obedient to God. And there's a whole bunch of these as you go through where you see this. And you see this idea that all of this becomes really, really complicated if you try to do it on your own. And that's the key to all of this, is you cannot do this on your own. We are not capable of operating in paradoxes. I had a friend, might be strong, a colleague when I was in law school, who thought he was going to outsmart me. It was a question I'd heard before, so he was already behind the 8 ball from that standpoint. Anytime you ask a lawyer a question they've heard before, you could bet they've come up with an answer by now. So he said, can God make a rock that's so heavy that nobody can lift it? And I said, yeah. And he said, so could God lift it? I said, yeah. And he said, well, wait, that's a contradiction. I said, well, actually, the question was a contradiction. So you actually created a question that was inherently contradictory and then asked me to solve it. But more fundamentally, you're operating under the rules of human creation and human concepts, and God is outside of those. And anytime you're outside of the system that you're operating in, the rules of the system don't apply to you the way you think they do. And he didn't know what to do with that, because that was not the answer he expected at all. And he wasn't expecting me to bring in like physics and stuff like that into the discussion, so he shut up about it. But the key to understanding a lot about God is that God operates in ways that we would often find paradoxical. And I think that's part of why Paul so often talks about it in terms of it being a mystery, in terms of it being the wisdom of God versus the wisdom of man. In so many cases, the way that we think the world should look and the universe does look is correct in a physical sense, but it fails utterly whenever we move into the spiritual sense. And that's where we really are operating as Christians most of the time. That's where most of our most significant decisions are made. And so that's where it becomes absolutely vital that we have this new spirit and this new mind, because if we don't, we can't even understand what we're being asked to do, much less make any sense out of it and do it. And so we kind of understand godliness as being a more complex concept when you think about it in those terms than simply saying, okay, we've got to do the right thing. Well, no, it's really not that easy. There's more to it than simply trying to do the right thing. There is trying to be the right thing and to be recreated and grace, and it's complicated. But it is that idea of that new self. Okay, anybody want to add something to that? I keep wanting to go ahead here and hit this button like a monkey who's trying to get a treat. So Steve, go ahead.
Well, unlike many other pathways that people have chosen to reach a higher level of spirituality in various religions, this is not a self-help situation. This is where you say, I have a helper that can come and help me do this. I don't have to just sit and meditate until my mind gets
expands.
expands.
Yeah.
Right. And so, but there's religions like that.
Yeah.
Large religions. That,
most of the Eastern religions are exactly like that.
yes. Yeah. And so it's a matter of controlling your thoughts, controlling your mind, or whatever in those religions, where here he's saying, lay aside yourself and just apply what is good,
Yeah,
and things can work out. You don't have to invent it, you just have to apply it.
yeah. And I think it's important to recognize, because when I'm talking about this, I'm not talking about a transformation where you transform it and you don't have to do anything, it just automatically works. There is, you know, in what we're looking at, Peter, he says, add godliness to these things, do something. And in other places, it talks about, you know, doing what it says. James, you know, don't just look in the mirror, actually do, you know, listen to the word, do what it says. So there's an application side of this where we try our best. And as we try our best, it becomes more natural to us. Just like any other thing that we work at, we get better at it as we go along. And the only reason that we get better at it consistently, if we're going against our nature, is because the Spirit of God is in us. But nevertheless, we have to keep doing. We can't just sit back. Okay, the Spirit of God's in me, so I'm automatically going to make all the right choices. You know, because we've seen a lot of Christians who obviously don't do that. And that's kind of the key here. Is it's worth pointing out that Paul isn't talking to people who are worldly people. He's talking to people in this letter who are Christians. And yet he's saying you can fall into the trap of not allowing the new self to run the show. You can fall into the trap of thinking that it's okay to default back to the old way of thinking and to your old way of life and your old self, and that doesn't do you any good. That is not going to get you where you need to be. And so when we look at Christians who are like this, we typically see people who talk in terms of, well, God would want me to have this. God would want me to do this. And so they use the words, but they don't have the meaning behind it. They're still substituting me for what God really wants, and then they're saying this is what God must want from me. I mean, if you look, one of the single biggest and most growing segments of the evangelical community is the prosperity theology movement, which is built around the idea that God wants me to be rich. And so, you know, whether it's sending in tithes or gifts, sowing seeds is the term that they use to a televangelist, or whether it's, you know, doing a variety of different things. They talk in terms of that basically if you do certain things, God is obligated, because he's made promises, he's obligated to give you money and give you success and everything else. And I suppose if you're a minister of the prosperity theology, you might have good reasons to believe it, because you're usually going to be pretty wealthy off of all the idiots who keep sending you money. But that has nothing to do with what the scriptures talk about. That's just, I've found a way to use the scriptures to justify what I want to do. But there's so many other scriptures that contradict it, and yet we are so fascinated by this idea of wealth that people buy into this because they think, well, that must be what God wants me to get. That must be what God wants me to do, you know? And so it's very, very easy for people, even as Christians, to substitute themselves in place of God. And in doing that, Paul says they end up going right back to their old self again. It's just you with a nice shiny veneer kind of, you know, painted over it to make you look like you're nicer or better. Okay, let's move on to the next one. So he says, to godliness add brotherly kindness. We're going to talk about brotherly kindness today in the sermon a little bit. Not in the context quite of what we're looking at the passage here, but in Galatians, Paul says, brethren, even if anyone is caught in any trespass, you who are spiritual, restore such a one in a spirit of gentleness, each one looking to yourselves, so that you too will not be tempted. Bear one another's burdens, and therefore fulfill the law of Christ. This is an interesting passage. I don't think you have the rest of it. No, an interesting passage to me, because he says, bear one another's burdens, and thereby fulfill the law of Christ. And then he talks about basically, you know, get a job, work, do good things, so that you can carry your own burden. And it's kind of really interesting, because it's the same time, and once he's saying, bear one another's burdens and carry your own burden. Don't be a burden to everybody else. Which there again, it would seem like a paradox, although this one's a little bit easier to unpack, because we know that the nature of our lives is that there are times when we're really doing well, and there are times when we need help, you know. And Steve was talking about, you know, he's bearing the whole burden of kind of running the house right now, because Karen is not in a position to do a lot of it. So he goes and he works, and when he comes home, he has to, you know, get the other stuff done. And the way those of us who are single have always had to do. But little side note there. But anyway, anyway, whatever. Anyway, so the point though is,
if you're single, you have less to take care of.
That's true. That is a very good point. And when you're single, you do have less than me and the dog. That's pretty much all I have to worry about sometimes. So right now, not even so much the dog, because that's mostly Sue's thing. So the reality though is that we know what it's like to be at the best, at our best of our game, where it feels like, you've got a lot of energy and things are going well in your life, and then you look around and you see other people who are struggling, and it becomes a lot easier in those times to help them along, whether they're struggling spiritually, whether they're struggling financially, whatever it is. But we also know that that is not always the way it is, and there are times when we struggle, and we need somebody else to have compassion on us, to help us out physically, to help us out emotionally, to help us out spiritually. And so it's always ideal to be able to carry our own load, but it's not always possible. And so as Christians, we need to recognize. They vacuuming in there?
Yes, it's my children.
Did they make a mess?
Probably.
The reason I ask is because at school we have this custodian who, like, he can't get the whole building cleaned after hours, so he starts vacuuming while school is still going on. It's incredibly distracting when he's outside just going to town on the carpet and you're trying to talk about something in history, so anyway.
No, Linda thinks glitter's cute, so.
Oh, okay. Well, it is, as long as it stays on something. But. All right, so anyway. Wow, I got enough of my game there. So, all right. So, the point is though that there are definitely times when we need other people's help, and we need to have people to pick us up and help us keep moving along. And so, the most significant and most serious of those times is when we have fallen away from the path, when not maybe just stumbled, although sometimes it is just a matter of stumbling, and when somebody's fallen down you just pick them up, but more dangerously is when somebody is being dragged away from the path, and I think the tendency in larger churches especially is sometimes to say, maybe not to say this even, it's just to not really even notice it. Because there's so many people, and everybody else seems to be there, and you don't even notice that somebody's not been there for a while. You don't even notice that somebody seems to be really off track in some way, and it becomes very easy to just let a little bit go in the churn, because there's more people coming in all the time. There's people moving somewhere else all the time. So church people kind of just got to get churned under the waves. We just don't notice it, My parents were longtime members of the Mason Church of Christ, and at some point they took over a ministry. As a deacon, or maybe when my dad was an elder, he took over something that just wasn't really being done, and that was follow-up, basically. And he and my mom were deeply distressed to realize that there was a list of, by the time they got the list, it was probably closing on 100 people that had just basically disappeared without anybody ever following up to find out what was going on. Now, it turned out as they began to follow, many of them had moved away, and that explained it, but ultimately there was probably 30 or 40 people on that list who had just kind of just disappeared over the time. Because when you've got 600 to 800 members, it's easy for a little bitty percentage like that to just start to disappear, And that's one of the things about a little church like this. It is not easy to disappear in a little church like this. It's serious about that whole thing. I wasn't necessarily feeling like going to church today, but I knew I'd get like 12 calls, and so I just said, I better go anyway, So it's but that's a good thing, It's a good thing when people, and I've had that mindset sometimes, It's not so much when as a professional preacher, but there have been other times where I have thought, man, I just don't feel like going today, and then I think, but I'm going to get called by my mom, and you never want to talk to my mom. That's you didn't show up for church anyway. So and going to church is by far and away not the only standard we're talking about here. In fact, that's the smaller thing. The bigger thing is knowing people well enough to know when things are going wrong in their lives and they're still showing up for church. Because just because people are showing up for church doesn't mean that everything's going okay. Once they stop coming, that's the point at which things have gone far enough off the rails that it's a lot harder to retrieve the situation anyway. So our job is to notice when people are in trouble, to notice when people are struggling, and to ask the right questions and listen and find ways to provide assistance to someone who is struggling with sin, with grief, with whatever it might be, to figure out ways that we can reach out to those people. And this is one of those places where, ironically, our own sufferings and our own difficulties and our own temptations can be actually very, very valuable to us. Why? Ha, you didn't expect me to ask a question there, did you? People look up like, what? He asked a question. Crud, I wasn't listening. I get that look a lot during when I'm teaching, by the way. So, because you've been there, exactly. So somebody comes to you and starts talking about the loss of a child, and most of us are going to be like, I know it must be awful, but I've never really had that happen. But some people have had that happen, you know. Somebody talks about the loss of a spouse after many years of marriage, and that's, I'm sorry, I'm probably never going to be very good at being able to address that personally, because I've never experienced that personally, and I doubt I ever will. But, you know, but there are things that all of us have experienced, negative things, temptations, loss, trial, whatever it might be, that when somebody else has those things happening, we are able to not only sympathize and empathize, but also to say, here's how I got through that. Here's how I'm getting through that in some cases, because some of that stuff doesn't just go right away or something like that, you know? So there's a value in brotherhood, a value in family that comes in part from shared experiences and commonalities of experiences, that if we're trying to do this all by ourselves, we don't have any way to fall back on them, you know? So when we see somebody struggling, it's really important for us, if we've struggled with something similar, to be the ones who are willing to step up and say, okay, I've gone through this, and here's how I deal with this. Here's how I address this. Or you know, whatever it might be. So that's a big part of our job as Christians, is to be part of that support network. And he says, now you got to be careful, and this is really true when we talk about some kinds of addictive temptations in particular, and all temptation is addictive in a way, but certain kinds of addictions, drugs, alcohol, those kinds of things. If you get around those things and you're somebody who is a drug addict or an alcoholic, even being around that stuff can be very problematic for you. And so that may not be, despite the fact that you have the experience with it, that may not be the intervention you need to be a part of until they're far enough past that you're not going to be tempted by whatever it is they're doing. But we do need to be mindful about the fact that Satan is very clever, and one of the easiest ways to get people to make a bad decision, I don't know if you're familiar with this, is to couch it in terms of, can you please help me, I'm struggling with this thing. You can get people to do all sorts of stupid things to help you when you present it as, I need help, as opposed to, I deserve this, or I want this, or I'll pay you to do this for me, or whatever. If you present it in terms of, I need help, people will do some pretty dumb things. I just watched a video on the internet. These two hikers, this goat got in Hawaii. I don't know that many goats in Hawaii, but apparently there are in one of the islands, Kauai or something. Anyway, got up on this mountain in a very, very steep place where there's just, and it got stuck on basically sort of this rocky crag there, and it couldn't get down because to jump down to the sort of, path is not a good word for it, the surface below, it might have stumbled and fallen, so it was stuck up there for like 2 days. And so these two hikers, they climbed up there and they walked along this narrow passage, no ropes, nothing to support them, and eventually they were able to use treats and stuff like that to coax the goat to come close enough to them they could grab it, at which point it started struggling, and they really had to kind of, were worried about their balance, and then they managed to bring it back down and bring it home. And it was an inspiring story about rescuing an animal. On one level, it is an inspiring story, but on the other hand, it's an inspiring story about just how dumb people can be. Because that's a goat. If the goat falls off the side of the mountain, it kind of is a bummer, but it's just a goat. If you fall off the side of a mountain, think how much that's going to impact the people who know you and love you and care about you, and of course how much the ground is going to impact you as well. So it's not, on the one hand, you see that there's, it's kind of those things where we're good job, you saved the goat, but on the other hand, it's like, wow, it was a goat, So when we ask for help and when people are in need, a lot of times we will do things that aren't very smart in order to try to help people, because we also don't necessarily apply the wisdom that we ought to. Steve talked to me yesterday, or last Sunday, about a guy who ended up giving all of his stuff away and putting himself in bankruptcy to try to help people financially, without ever telling anybody what he was doing, including his wife, that he was doing this, And so, if you want to make a decision like that, I suppose, I'm not going to tell you can't make a decision like that. I do think if you're married, you absolutely have the obligation of telling your spouse before you go and do something like that, but we could make a choice like that. Paul said to the rich young ruler, give up everything away and come follow me. And most of the people who followed him literally walked away from whatever their jobs were, and they followed him. So there is a place for that kind of self-sacrifice, but it needs to be an informed self-sacrifice. It needs to be a conscious, cognizant choice that we make in order to do those kinds of things. And so as Christians, we're called to exercise judgment as well as compassion when we're helping other people, and find ways to kind of, again, to make that paradox work. John?
I was back to the animal thing. I mean, that's kind of a pagan concept. Eastern philosophies and religions, they see animal life as being equal to human life. In fact, in reincarnation, you could come back as an animal. So in India, you know, they follow the cows around because they're when they defecate, it's too holy to hit the ground because they think it's past relatives,
Right.
previous generations.
Well, you know, I guess I wouldn't want to let my, you know, grandfather hit the ground like that. It would be kind of a bummer, but it seems like the nature of what it become was even more.
Well, they're starving to death and they don't have anything to eat and they
Right.
don't eat the cows.
Well, and you're right, there is an element, although I don't think that was so much this, as much as just in general in our society, we have placed a level of value on animals and on pets and things like that that's probably pretty excessive relative to what they actually do have value. And I'm a little leery about talking about this too much because I definitely get too attached to my dogs. So, but at the same time, there needs to be a recognition that these are animals and we're people, and there is a distinction between those two things. So.
In the Bible, a dog is one of the lowest things you could possibly be.
That's true.
And I love my dog, but our modern society has elevated the dog to the point of an idol. I mean, people are
That's
better to
probably
their
true.
dogs than they are their kids.
Well, yeah, I mean, and I've met some of their kids, so I kind of understand that. Okay, so let's move on. So then in Titus, Paul says, our people, he's talking to Titus. Of course, where's Titus? Anybody know where Titus is operating out of? Crete is where Titus is operating out of. So the word we have, Cretan, today, it literally comes out of the description of the people who lived in Crete. And the term Cretan today is someone who is dumb and makes stupid decisions and is kind of excessively focused on sensuality. And I don't mean sensuality in the sense of sexuality necessarily, I mean it in the sense of an excessive focus on how I feel about things and making myself feel good. So when Paul talks about it, he actually says, there's a common saying about Cretans, and it's like the Cretans are all just a bunch of mindless idiots who just want what's good for them. And he said, and this is true. And that's what you want to hear. There's a common statement that a lot of people believe in, and that's actually true. Yeah, they're a bunch of idiots. So good luck with that, Titus. No, what he says is, our people, the Christians who are on Crete, the Cretan Christians, must also learn to engage in good deeds to meet pressing needs so that they will not be unfruitful. That's kind of interesting, and it does speak to an element, to an extent, to the society and the basis of our society in Christian behaviors and doctrines and principles, that our society, even today, still is aware of the need to do good things to meet pressing needs. And so whether it's governmental agencies that we've set up, whether it's so many different charities, I mean, there are literally thousands of charities that are designed to meet one or another need of people. Whether it's the gifts that are given, whether it's around the holidays or other times, within our society, even people who are not Christian by any means, they have an awareness of these pressing needs. And I think you can chalk part of that up to the fact that we do have a Christian undercurrent running through this country. I don't like the term Christian nation because I don't think that that's a biblical concept, but I do like the idea and recognize that just as many of our founding fathers put things in motion that were designed and built around Christian principles, and just as many of the, most in fact, of the early leadership and the ongoing leadership of our country has been people who were either Christians who were giving honor to Christian principles, some of those ideas have become sort of embedded in our society in ways that we don't even necessarily recognize how different it makes us from previous societies and generations. But when you look at the society that the Romans had, or that was existed on Crete, there was no sense of an obligation to help the less fortunate. You know, that was just their tough luck, either because they'd made bad choices or because the gods were judging them or whatever it was. And Paul says we got to make sure that our people understand that that's not how it's supposed to be. That you're not supposed to just look at somebody else and go, yeah, it's your problem. You know, and so Paul wants to make sure that Titus is teaching the idea of engaging in good deeds, in kindness to other people, even when you don't necessarily owe them an obligation or have a direct relationship to them. Because even back then, people understood you're supposed to take care of your family. And most people would have agreed to that. If you didn't take care of your family, you would have been a social outcast for doing that, or failing to do that, I should say. But doing good things for other people people who believe the same things that you do, who are part of the same family spiritually that you are, would not have come naturally to the people on Crete. And yet Paul says we got to make sure that they learn how to do that, because that's part of what it means to be a good Christian. So brotherly kindness is built into Christianity. In fact, what is the rule, the principle that Jesus articulates?
Love your brother as yourself.
Love your brother as yourself, but there's another one as well, beyond that. We call it the golden rule, we tell it to our kids.
Treat everybody as you'd like to be treated.
Do unto others as you would have them do unto you. Not as they deserve, not do unto others as they've done unto you, not any of those things, just do unto others as you would have them do unto you. And this is presuming, of course, that what you would want for yourself is the best. It's always a little dangerous when you say that to somebody who's a little bit too masochistic or something. It might be, if you think about it, it's funny to me because my dad grew up. I'm going to stop with this. We're already over time, but I got to tell you this. So, my dad grew up in Indiana, and in Indiana, there's kind of two things that in the environment that he grew up in. One of them is that Freemasonry has a very strong presence in that area, and Freemasonry has this idea about helping people versus accepting help. And the basic principle is you make sure that you're taking, it's kind of what we were talking about with the previous passage, you make sure your stuff is taken care of and then you help other people, but you do it secretly. You don't call attention to yourself when you're helping somebody else. All of which is totally a noble goal. But it creates a really interesting problem because they're always looking for ways to help other people, but everybody else is trying really hard to make it look like they don't need any help. And if you try to help them, like, no, don't help me, I'm okay, and so you have this really weird situation where it makes it really hard to actually engage in good deeds for other people because they're so busy trying to say, no, don't help me, I'm okay, help somebody else. Well, nobody else wants help either, And so you get into this weird situation where people refuse to accept charity, refuse to even accept to let somebody else. My dad and his grandfather used to get into these arguments at restaurants about who's going to pay the bill. Man, I've got to take it. I've got to, they, like, what am I going to arrange it when they came into the restaurant? They tell the server, pay me the bill. It's like, holy cow! Really, this is, good heavens, let somebody else pay the bill once in a while. So it's fascinating to see that sometimes the mistake that we make as Christians isn't so much in taking care of our own stuff as it is in letting other people show us kindness and charity. And it's hard for us to do that sometimes because we think, especially if you're a guy, I think, as a guy, you have been told, if you were raised right, that's a little judgmental, but if you were raised right, you have been told that a man takes care of his business, and a man takes care of himself and takes care of his family and doesn't have to have somebody else help him. But the truth is, we always all need certain amounts of help. And one of the ways that we give honor to God is by accepting help from people when we need it. And we give them an opportunity to do something kind. Now, that doesn't mean we should go around with our hand out all the time just to see if we can get people to, honor God more. But it does mean that in times when we do really need something, or when somebody's been generous enough to provide us with something that was a kindness, we should accept it graciously, and we should give thanks for having been given it. And that it gives us an opportunity maybe to give something to somebody else. So these are some really important principles for us as Christians in terms of how we approach brotherly kindness, both giving it and receiving it. All right, I'm going to stop here. Any last comments that are really important and you feel like we need to get in? All right, so next week we'll pick up here and we'll keep moving on through Peter.